What's up, kids? It's Mrs. Thorson again. This is chapter 5, the presidency. I'm so excited. Presidents, this is why I got into teaching government history. This is my jam. I'm skipping section 1. We're going to start with section 2 today. So if you have your notes out or if you have a piece of paper you want to write stuff down with, I'd make sure to get that out right now while my presentation is loading. This section, like I said, I'm skipping section 1. We're going to move on to section 2. And we're basically describing, let me move myself. Let's move myself up there. The powers of the presidency and the ways in which the president influences the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy is the fourth branch of government and their job is to implement stuff. So the president, but it's really a part of the executive branch. So the president can't do everything by himself. So he relies on the bureaucracy to help him out. All right. So how do you become president and what are their qualifications, term of office, length of tenure, that kind of stuff? So remember, we do not pick the president ourselves. The Electoral College picks the president. And it was done for a couple of reasons. Number one, it helped represent the small states. Because if we just had the popular vote, then only the big cities would rule the country. The big populated states would rule the country because that's where the most numbers are. That's where people would campaign. And that's kind of like, in order to get votes, they would appeal to urban voters rather than everybody. Whereas if you have the Electoral College, it makes it so that small states have a chance too, and rural and suburban areas. They also didn't really trust the American people at the time. That's another one. They're like, we don't really trust that they can do it right. So we kind of need to have a group of smart people who can do it the right way and pick the right person. So what we do is we have the popular vote. And then, for instance, in Illinois, let's say we have the popular vote and it's, let's look back at 2016, Hillary versus Trump. And Hillary won the popular vote. It was about 60-40. She won every one of our electors in the state of Illinois. So that means, since she's a Democrat, the Democrats of Illinois got to pick 20 hardcore Democrats to be the electors who made the official vote for the president of the United States, in that case, Hillary. When the president takes office, they have 4-year terms. At first, there was no term limits. George Washington set the precedent of what presidents can do. He said, let's just do 2 terms. That's it. And then once FDR got in and just decided he could do whatever he wanted and ran 4 times, they got a little nervous and were like, okay, that was a bit much. We should probably limit it to 2 terms. So they actually made an amendment to the Constitution, the 22nd, 2 terms. That's how you can remember that. What do you have to be when you're president of the United States? You have to be a natural born citizen. So I'm thinking, should I be president of the United States? Let's see. Do I qualify? I am a natural born citizen. I could do that. 14 years living in the country prior to running. Done that. I've lived here my whole life. And 35 years old. Shoot, I'm 29 forever. So I guess I can never be president of the United States. What a bummer. Okay. Skipping this because you're reading it tonight. Skip. Okay. So presidential powers, there's formal powers and informal powers. The formal powers are what's written in Article 2 of the Constitution. These are given explicitly to him. And then there's informal powers that are kind of, implied that they have. But they have 5 key roles when executing powers. All right, number 1, they are the chief executive. That is the number 1 power of the president, to execute the law or to enforce the law. It says in the Constitution that the president is to faithfully execute the law. And they don't really say how. They're super vague about it because they knew that it was a new type of executive position and they didn't want to give them too much power, but there still needed to be some leadership there. So they were kind of like, here, George Washington, kind of figure it out for yourself. Good luck with that. Okay. So eventually Washington realized this. Actually, Washington realized this right away. He's like, I can't do all this by myself. And he actually was the one that came up with the idea of making a cabinet. And that's part of the bureaucracy. That's like our original bureaucracy, is the cabinet. So he's like, I'm an expert in war. I'm an expert in leadership. I don't know much about necessarily diplomacy or defense not defense, money or law. Okay. So he created Secretary of State, Defense. At the time they called it War, Secretary of Treasury. attorney general to help him out. Now, eventually, the bureaucracy expanded. Now we have 2.7 million people working in our bureaucracy. It's a little bit more than the 4 that we had with Washington. But their job is to basically, anytime a law is made or an executive order, they help execute that law. Now, this cabinet, it wasn't in the Constitution. He kind of just made it up, and then the Senate officially was one that created it, because remember, they're the one, or the Congress, because they're the ones that create the laws. But the rule that they created was that anytime a president nominates a cabinet member, the Senate has to approve it, very similar to how they have to approve like Supreme Court justices. Sometimes patronage still applies. It was really bad with Andrew Jackson, and then it lasted up through Garfield. That was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, because Garfield was assassinated over patronage. They're like, wait, I should have gotten a job, and you gave it to your friend, and he got killed. So they're like, maybe we should pick people based on merit. That might help. But a lot of times we still see patronage apply, where you pick people that have either done stuff for you politically or are close to you personally. The choices do vary. Presidents can be loyal to departments. Some can be loyal more to the president than others. And they can have connections to private businesses. I know that sometimes, like Betsy DeVos, for instance, the Department of Education secretary, she's never been a teacher, but she's been in private, involved in the advocacy of private schools and charter schools and stuff like that. And they try to mirror the diversity of the American people. So like what they'll do is they get different people of different races, ethnicities, genders, and then geographic locations. President Trump's from New York, so you think he might want to try to get everyone from New York. No, he gets them from all over the country. So here are the different secretary cabinets and different people that work for the White House. They put it in order over here, if you notice, of what was created first of the departments, and then over here, where are we? Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Homeland Security, that was created. That was the last one to be created. But these are all people that work for the White House too. Like the White House Chief of Staff is kind of like the one that runs the show. The president's number 2 man in the White House with him every day. They're also the chief diplomat. That diplomacy is peaceful talks with foreign countries. So they try to guide U.S. foreign policy. And actually, the president has more power in foreign policy than domestic, because people don't care as much about foreign policy as they do about domestic policy, because we're home, we want stuff for us. So they have more control over what they can do. They can also make treaties. They can't approve them. They can make it. That's like that story with Wilson, where he made the Treaty of Versailles, came back to the United States, and he's like, look at this amazing thing. I love it. And the Senate's like, no, we don't. Reject. So you can make them, but you got to get them approved by Senate. And they are the symbolic head of the United States. They are, just like any country's president, just like with Putin, or just like with Boris Johnson, or President Xi in China. Like, they are the symbolic head of those countries, just like President Trump is. So like I said, he has that advantage on the national stage because he's just one person. Whereas like Congress, there's 535 of them. It's hard for them to be like a figurehead on a national stage. So here's an example. This is former Prime Minister Theresa May, her and President Trump meeting together, just working on diplomatic relations between the United States and the UK. They're also the chief legislature. We've seen this expand over time. It started with Teddy Roosevelt when he was using his bully pulpit to make speeches about his square deal, where he has this vision for what the country should be like. We see this in the State of the Union addresses, but beforehand, like the State of the Union wasn't really like the president would give the speech to Congress, but like no one would really hear about it. Well, now that it's televised, you can watch it all the time. And this is what my vision of the country. And people, again, tend to listen to that one person versus the 535 in Congress. So that's why he is considered the chief legislature. Of course, he can veto bills. Anytime a bill comes to his desk, Senate approves it, the House approves it. They're like, look at this beautiful bill, pass it. And they can just stamp it with a veto. Now, Congress can override that with 2/3 vote in each house, but that's really difficult to do. And then, of course, the pocket veto. So here's what happens: a bill comes to the president's desk, and if the president doesn't sign it within 10 days of it being on his desk, and Congress is still in session, it just becomes law. Sometimes presidents will do that if they don't want to like put their name to something, but they also don't want to reject it because it might make them look like a jerk. But there's also this other thing called the pocket veto. So let's say it sits on the president's desk for 10 days, but within that 10 days, Congress like quits for the year. They end their session. Well, there's nothing that they can do to override a veto, so it just dies. It's like you put it in your pocket to die. And Lincoln did those a lot. And it basically, it's like, again, if you don't want to, if you're like, let's say it's something about, let's say your whole platform is being a fiscal conservative. You don't want to spend a lot of money. And then all of a sudden you get this bill on your desk that's $1 billion for orphanages. You're like, well, I don't want to sign it because I promised to be a fiscal conservative, but I don't want to veto it because it's children. I feel like I look like a jerk. So you might just leave it be because then you don't have to take credit one way or another. Of course, commander-in-chief, if you've heard of any of these, commander-in-chief, top of the military, has to be a civilian. So you're like, well, what about Washington or Eisenhower and Grant? Well, they were retired. They weren't in the military at the time of being president. And they wanted to put that in the hands of a civilian so that we don't turn into some type of military dictatorship. But they do limit the president's war-making powers in the Constitution because it gives Congress the right to declare war. But the president has like gotten throughout American history in thousands of like mini wars because he'll send troops places that need help. You know, the last time we've officially had a declared war was World War II. So obviously we've had a lot of skirmishes since then with where the president acts as commander-in-chief without congressional approval. Here's an example where in 2016, this military aide carries the president's nuclear arsenal command case. Oh my gosh, that's like scary that all of that is just in one case. And that behind you, the helicopter, that would be Marine One, and it's called that if the president's on it. So like it could be like any type of it could be a news helicopter, and if a Marine pilot was flying it and the president was in it, it's called Marine One. They also can pardon people. We've seen this a lot. This is a very controversial thing because they can basically override a conviction and say someone can be free from being convicted except with impeachment. So this is basically this is usually granted right when they're leaving office because it's so controversial. They're like, well, what are you going to do to me now? I'm already gone. But we do see this happen a lot with, like, for instance, President Trump pardoning Roger Stone, and people were pretty upset about that. President Obama pardoning Chelsea Manning, people were upset about that. Probably the most famous pardon, though, was when Ford pardoned Nixon. So what are some of the things they can do without like any other branch? And this gives them way more power, kind of like negates the checks and balances. One is executive privilege, which is something that they've claimed over time, where the president can keep certain secrets from outside scrutiny, especially Congress. And they claim that a lot. So if Congress is ever trying to investigate the president, they can say, well, I have executive privilege. I don't have to give that to you. And that gives the president more power over Congress. But like with U.S. versus Nixon, when that happened, Congress did rule and win. They're like, this is kind of a national security thing. We get to see the tapes. Executive agreements is basically the same thing as a treaty, but without congressional approval. But let's say like President Trump makes an executive agreement with France, okay? And let's say Biden wins. If Biden were to win, he could get rid of that. He could just totally null and void it. Where if it was a treaty approved by Congress, they can't get rid of those things. So they're not technically binding. A new president can get rid of those at any time. Whoop. Another thing is a signing statement where a president writes comments while signing a bill into the law. That's usually a political statement or reason for signing it. So they'll use it to control legislative action. So like what they'll try to do is like, I'll prove this, but this is why, and this is what I expect for it to do when it gets implemented. So that's their way of like having control over a bill that becomes law. And they're like, I will make this law, but this is what has to happen with it. And then executive orders are probably the most controversial of all of them. This is basically where the president can make an action that has the same power as law without any congressional approval. So probably the most infamous was the Executive Order 9066, where FDR interned the Japanese Americans, 110,000 of them, into like our version, they call them internment camps. They were like concentration camps, and they said it was in the name of national security. But the thing about executive orders is just like executive agreements. Once a new president comes in, the new president can completely get rid of it. So like actually on President Trump's like first day of office, right when he became president, that was like his first order of business was to get rid of a ton of President Obama's executive orders. If it was a law, can't do that. So like Obamacare, he can't do that. It was law. It was passed by Congress, approved by President Obama. But with any executive order, like the legal granting, not citizenship, but legal rights in the country for 5 million undocumented illegal immigrants. That was one that President Obama had put in as an executive order, and President Trump got rid of. Skip this. Skip that for now. So ask yourself at the end of this, why is it difficult for Congress to check the power of the president, even though there's formal checks? You have to think about this, and I want you to think about my clue is the one-man show of the presidency. And how have presidents used executive agreements, orders, and signing statements to expand their power? Think about that, because these are the types of questions you're going to get with FRQs. Speaking of FRQs, I want you to work on that now. Other than that, I am done. Have a good one.